Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. IoT, 3 letters, 2 vowels, 1 consonant, 0 reputation for security, and a few million reasons why that's a problem. Which means this week we chat with Paddy Harrington about changing the course of IoT security from its insecure past. Start small and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva, a Thales company, is the cybersecurity leader that helps organizations protect critical applications, APIs, and data anywhere, at scale, and with the highest ROI. With an integrated approach combining edge, application security, and data security, Imperva protects companies through all stages of their digital journey. Imperva Threat Research and their global intelligence community enable Imperva to stay ahead of the threat landscape and seamlessly integrate the latest security, privacy, and compliance expertise into their solutions. Start a free trial today at securityweekly.com/Imperva. This is episode 297, recorded August 26, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike, good morning. I'm here to give you a top 10 list of hellos.
And I've just been derailed mentally. Oh no. Let's see. I'm going to have, if you want to find out about all those top 10 lists of hellos and other ways John Kinsella can break my brain, don't lose access to the Security Weekly content you know and love. Please make sure your favorite podcast feeds are up to date. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe now. Paddy is a senior analyst at Forrester, advising security and risk professionals. He focuses on endpoint security on platforms ranging from desktops to IoT devices. His research includes the endpoint's impact on the security of business applications and data in light of the proliferation of edge devices and the evolving work environment. Hello, Paddy. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Great to be here.
And we're happy to have you here because we do want to focus on those endpoint devices like IoT, and I might have alluded a little bit at the beginning that they don't have a great reputation. And there's probably a couple reasons for that, constrained environments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe let's maybe start on the downbeat and see if we can end on a point of optimism. You know, what got us here to talk about the IoT's bad reputation in the first place? What are some of the highlights that you look to that are just the sins of the past that remain here in the present?
Yeah, that's a great one. The problem is, I think, with IoT devices is because someone isn't sitting in front of it all day, you didn't think about security on it, right? It was an afterthought. So common practices that you don't see on desktops, you'll see on IoT, especially the legacy devices, encoded passwords, right? They're hard-coded into the system. They can't be changed. And once that happens, this information gets easily accessible on the internet. It's shared all over the place. You know, you can go to websites and find lists of known passwords. Open ports on the network, right? So instead of it being just the ports that you need to access the device or they need to access and talk to each other, it's a wide range of ports, which, again, in a standard environment for desktops and servers, it's unheard of. But on an IoT device, there you go, it's great. And then the fact that, you know, another simple one is that the care and feeding of these devices is so minimal. You know, they're updated so infrequently, especially when it comes to security. So if you take all those, 3 sins right there, smush them together with a bunch of other, depending on the device type, and what you have is a ridiculously insecure product that is put on your home network, business networks, public networks, and it gets really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think that part is a good distinction because we are largely breaking this down into IoT. We're not talking about OT yet or big operational industrial things. But as you said, there's BYOD and either in one way or another, that unintentional creep of IoT devices onto corporate networks, business networks, et cetera. So, you know, and some of these they could be smart microphones, they could be smart cameras, they could be all kinds of anything smart or not so smart. But let's talk a little bit about sort of that aspect of what happens. Like, I think it's pretty clear, the weak passwords, easily guessable, accessed, somebody looking at your camera, that's already pretty creepy. What are some of the other things that consumers may not be aware of or appreciate when they just plug something in via cable or pop it onto their Wi-Fi network?
Yeah. I think the most common IoT device, and people don't think of it as one, but everyone has in their home, is that home router, right? This really is an IoT device when you break it down. So because of that, people don't think about the security of this device, but it's not patched, it's not updated. They use whatever password came with it, maybe, or they do something simple because it's easier to remember. So now here you have this internet-facing device that can be accessed literally from everywhere, and attackers take advantage of that. So if you look on IoT threats and things of that nature that are common for consumers, it's people attacking vulnerabilities in those routers. And there's two reasons for it. One is now to get into your home and steal other personal as well as possible business data, because so many people work from home, as you can see. But it's also using those devices as what's called a botnet. And hopefully in the consumer world, people understand that. But if you don't, this is a bunch of little or maybe even big devices used to compromise or attack another network. So that's taking over this little small device, do that 1,000 to some of the bigger ones 1,000,000 times, and you can really crush systems. There's a couple of really big name ones out there. EnemyBot is a continuous one. It's been running for like 4 years now. It's really sad. But they take over these IoT devices and they use them to target either other individuals. As one of them was last year, they actually targeted a website that was behind Cloudflare for a security researcher, as well as for businesses, right? And they do it for fun and profit.
So, and I think John and I covered an article a couple weeks ago about someone who was actually looking into why is my router sending these packets off to this strange IP address I don't recognize. So yeah, there's definitely some curiosity there, interest there. So that helps us with the what could go wrong. But I want to try and pull us back as well as what can go right, what should be going right. And maybe there's a couple ways we might approach this. One is we talked about weak passwords. I think modern within the last 1 to 2 years, devices are being created with better default password management, not common passwords, but probably lots of them are still being written in C. They still have these other types of problems. And so if we skip over the weak passwords part and try and talk about like the code that's actually being built, what kind of design problems do you see there? Or if you had that magic wand that you could wave and wish things suddenly were written better, written differently, perhaps in the IoT world, what might that look like?
I think the benefit we've seen recently is there's been more concern, so it goes into the password side, which is good. Mm-hmm. But then because of regulation, and I'm not going to get into my normal spiel about regulation, I'll leave it alone. But because of the changes I think we're seeing from consumers in general, and whether that is a home consumer or a business, developers of these products are being more concerned with the security of the code. So it's not just, test it a couple times. All right, this is good. Throw it out the door. No, they're putting more effort into their coding and being more conscious of security. It's not great, but they're getting better. So because of that, they're using different languages. There's a wide range of them out there that are in use. C and the C variants, plus, and so forth. It's still in use. Java is still in use, and JavaScript. But I'm also starting to see Rust come up a bit. I'm starting to see Python, of all things, on some IoT devices. PHP. There's other protocol. Yeah, I know, right? There's other coding languages that are being used for the IoT devices now, and it's a bit of a mix, but it's moving away from the old. So there's some goodness to that, right? And because there's more regulations coming in, predominantly right now out of Europe, but the US is catching on, at least with guidance, you're starting to see more effort put into the testing. And they're doing testing in things that you didn't see before, right? One of the faults IoT devices had is if you throw garbage data at an IoT device, because it has low processing power, it throws up. I know this is a bad term, but still, it fails and it resets and goes back to its boot cycle. So what they're starting to do now is they're starting to do more dynamic testing to these devices so that you can't flood it with garbage, do a basic DDoS attack and bring it down. It'll withstand a little more heat. Now this isn't all devices, but it's the more larger ones, the little tiny sensors. Okay, they may crash though, but the bigger ones, they're getting better.
And part of that too is you're kind of touching a little bit on the constraints of the device itself, because they don't have a lot of processing power, memory, et cetera. But what we've also seen because of that is a lot of these devices are like a Raspberry Pi, for example. They're running essentially Linux kernels, but the developers disable kernel protections. They disable stack protections, which maybe there's an argument because it's not like this is a multi-user environment, right? But that does mean that if there is that buffer overflow, it's going to be dead simple to exploit. This is the old frac article, smashing the stack era technique that you need. You don't need anything more modern than that. So when you see like Python or Rust for that matter, do you see that making an appreciable difference because a lot of the vulnerabilities have been memory safety issues, or have those vulnerabilities been more like, here is the weak password, here is a trivial elevation of privilege, here is the web ecosystem around it, for example? I think we can pull off more than I think a top 10 list of items that can go wrong on these devices.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge right now, is because there's so many ways to attack these that the developers, and I think even, and I don't want to be faulting anyone on this, but I think even the security research to some extent didn't dive into all of the potential threats around the IoT devices. Because in the consumer world, if you think of it, these were things you added to your home network and they didn't seem to be a big exposure point, because why attack a home user? From attacker side, it's a low dollar value. All you do is get hey, I did this. Flags are nice, but nowadays, as I said, people do this a bit more for the profit than the fun. On the business, if we think about it back before 2020, businesses were thought of as these, walled empires. Right? Everything was inside the wall. And as long as your edge protection was good, okay, everything inside, you want to protect, but maybe not as much. Now that the business is everywhere, there is no defined perimeter. It's in flux all over the place. Securing these devices has become more of a priority. So not only from the defensive product side, but then the developer side, they're re-examining and saying, all right, we have to code better. We have to choose better kernel protections on the Linux side. We have to protect the memory space. Great. What else do we have to do? And that's why I think, like you're saying, within the last year, you've seen an evolution in the products to be more security aware. Are they there yet? Oh, heck no. It's going to probably be at least another 2 or 3 years until we're even close. But they're heading down the right path. So I'll give them a little credit for that. Businesses obviously have to work on their other defensive measures, but for the consumer, things are starting to get a little better.
So, Paddy, you sort of walked in the direction I want to go with this. You mentioned enterprise. What I've seen over the last, let's call it 5 years, the enterprises in industry have been looking at all this cool stuff going on in the house with like all our little gadgets going like, damn, I wish I could use some of that. I'm getting tired of doing ladder programming. And you now see companies like Siemens putting a Raspberry Pi into a box and letting someone throw it onto a DIN rail. It's still that same IoT device, but now it's just sort of happily sort of sauntered over to that side. So is this just purely a home thing, or how are you seeing it from your point of view in the industry?
Yeah, the enterprises have been dealing with IoT devices for a long time, and I think, unfortunately, they've just been throwing them on the network. As I'm sure you guys know, the dirty secret in business networking is the majority of business networks are flat. Really. I mean, they'll throw up VLANs like it's going out of style, but they don't wall off the segments and they don't do good traffic control. So you have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of these little IoT devices spread all over the network, and they've had free reign. So businesses within the last few years have really been trying to take hold and say, we have to control this traffic and we have to prioritize security of not only the devices, but the data. Because, like you said, And we're going to take this little Raspberry Pi, throw it here. We're going to take, we're going to bring in these smart refrigerators and toasters and coffee machines. And facilities doesn't know where to put them, so we'll put them on a network segment over here and open up to the world. Oops. So you've got all this happening within the enterprise, and now the security leaders, as they're locking down other endpoints, are realizing they have this massive segment they have to control. And it's in all industries. I've talked to people from, oil and gas, manufacturing, finance, and everyone is now dealing with, healthcare is a massive one that people think about. And they had a little bit of an uptick in doing security over the last couple of years, but then recently it's coming down as I think the staffing hasn't had the time to catch up and really secure these newer devices coming on. So it's every industry is having challenges.
So one of the things I made a nice living off for a few years was as larger enterprises, say banks, would want to use third-party software, they'd be like, hell no, I'm not using that without doing a software review, a code review. And that sort of drove the security of those applications, right, or those libraries. Are you seeing anything like that with IoT? Or my worry is they're so cheap that like the cost of having someone around for an hour or two is, way more than the cost of IoT. So how do you force security on them?
Yeah, it's scary because I think if you look at take banks, for example, right? Banks have the new stuff that they're trying to bring in, which because of some of the attacks that have happened, as well as just general concerns, they're focusing more on doing security reviews of the products that come in. But because there wasn't thought about for so long, they have tons of legacy devices, 5, 10, 15, 20 years old that they brought in under the IoT banner. And if it still runs, why take it offline? There are businesses out there, who still have LaserJet 5s on their network. Hats off to the LaserJet 5, it still works. But talk about an exploit waiting to happen. So I think this is the problem is, even though they want to try and bring in newer technologies and do it properly, right? Do those security reviews. Even if it's a small person sensor, right? It's waiting for people to pass through thresholds. Okay, it's a pain. You got to, review the code in that and do all those checks, but you're trying to be safe. They have thousands of legacy devices that don't go through those checks. And it's going to cost hundreds of thousands, if not, millions of dollars to replace that stuff. So you invest that money or you try and secure it.
And that ties into another angle I wanted to bring up, because there's this aspect of, I'm not going to get into big regulation discussions because I know poor John will fall asleep if I do. But, the FCC has their cyber trust mark. And one of the specific angles of that I did want to highlight is that they're telling brands, explicitly state what your lifetime of support is. And then you're going to have to commit to providing updates, et cetera, during that lifetime of support. But, we work in security. We know how to game systems, and you could say our lifetime of support is only going to be 2 and 3 years. But as you're pointing out, Paddy, a lot of these devices, the hardware can keep on going. Do you see, I don't know that consumers are going to care that much about looking up these type of nuances. Do you see a pressure from enterprises being successful, or a way that they can approach that?
It's going to be a tough pill to swallow, I think, for some of the people who are writing checks, because, we look now at things, the standard endpoints we think of, right? Smartphones, laptops, desktops. There was a turnover cycle on those. A lot of enterprises went to 3 years. Okay. And then the business realized, this device is really sustainable for 4 or 5 years, right? Especially as the applications move to the web. Well, if you think about it in that same context of IoT, it's doing a fixed task. This is a camera. This is a door lock. It's not like the thing is going to, sure, the hardware itself is going to break, but it's not like the code's going to break, And if everything's running, why pull it? And that's has been the concept, as I mentioned, our friend, the LaserJet 5. It's working. I don't need to replace it. Well, no. You have to put security into those financial costs and say, if you don't patch this, if you don't secure this, what is the financial cost of doing that? What is the financial risk? Better choice of words, I think, of not replacing this when the life cycle is ended. And if the risk is too high, forget it, pull it. and that has to come as part of the planning cycles, I think, for businesses now. And it's going to be definitely a hard pill to swallow.
I'm curious if you've seen how much of that, the risk, the cost estimates, that risk that you highlighted just now, how often you see enterprises doing that? Because my mind is going to things like hotels, which is an obvious case for smart locks, et cetera, where suddenly if there's a back door, there's a flaw in that smart lock, you have a very significant problem, and probably more so than if it's the smart lock to your, IT closet at on an enterprise. And so, that's very specific in hotels, but do you see enterprises, or how maybe should enterprises approach that, or what should they be threat modeling, if I want to pick up on that word, or thinking about these scenarios?
I think right now they haven't been, and they should be, because as I said, the IoT was in the environment and it worked. I didn't think about the security of it because I didn't have to. And you could say the same about OT. The only difference with many of the OT environments is they used to air gap them. They were really hard firewalled, so getting into the OT was a lot harder than the IoT side. But it's something that the security leaders and financial leaders are going to have to go through in the enterprise to determine what is our cycle of device replacement. And I talked to a couple enterprise leaders about this recently and saying this has to be part of your discussion. You have to plan for this thing to come off the wire. And if it can't, you have to factor in what is, the risk cost, as well as what security actions you can take to make sure that this is going to be safe in the environment.
One of those aspects, being safe in this environment, I'm going to introduce zero trust. And I'm attempting not to do this just to use a buzzword for the sake of it, but I'm going to just say the idea that there's a security check, a security perimeter that's being conducted on the device rather than the network. So rather than have, our castles and moats or whatever metaphors we want, that's what I'm thinking of zero trust. But a lot of these consumer devices, especially, don't have any of these capabilities or, strong authentication, things like that. Are enterprises even trying to get vendors to support that? Or are they still just, this is our 90s style of these are outside the moat?
Yeah, for the consumer devices, they're going to the network control. Right, they're going for that solution of let me get down to gateways, firewalls, things of that nature, and really, I'm going to wall these devices off, right, at the switch level or something, so that the traffic is only limited to where they can go. The device can go from, right? It can only go from the device to these two servers inside. These two desktops can talk to it to do administrative work, and then externally, they can only go to these 5 sites. So for, like I said, those consumer devices, that's kind of where your options get to. Once you get to the more enterprise-grade devices, yeah, they do have that zero trust control inside. So you can do certificate authentication on the device. So to say only authorized devices are allowed on this network segment, and they can only talk to these data sources, and the traffic is encrypted and so forth. So I think that's kind of where things are starting to head to. Whether the enterprise gets there, that's a different story, because you're now talking a major architectural change if they haven't done that already with your desktops and servers and such. So now you're really going through a whole redesign of your network to say IoT devices and then servers, desktops, and et cetera.
So is there something maybe that like Raspberry Pi, for example, could do to change here? Because, they have their C SDK, but, you can build a Python interface on top of that. As you mentioned, you can build a PHP, how to deal with firmware on top of that. Not exactly sure why. Sorry, PHP. But, would there be something that is fundamental that Raspberry Pi could do that helps the industry? Or is the industry just still, these are really low devices and it's really going to come down to cost of the hardware, cost of labor, and what we can sell it for?
The enterprise-grade devices are making the change.
Okay.
And they're starting to work with some of the certificate vendors who are out there, the bigger names. I won't get into mentioning names and such, but they're starting to work with the device manufacturers to integrate certificates in production so that you can have, if you will, a birth certificate that gets shipped with the device, and the industry or the business that gets it, they get obviously the device key, it's on there, but they then get the root. So they can now start controlling these devices in their enterprise, and they can take that full management, as well as the coders are getting in to say, okay, that's the source certificate, but now I want to do other certificates on the device to manage traffic better, right? So you've got one for the device, you've got one for the traffic. And then that can be managed by a different team. That can be managed by the network team and the data team. So they're trying to adapt to the needs that are coming onto enterprises. Consumers, I think we're a bit off on that just because, as you said, cyber trust market is just starting. The idea is just starting to propagate. There's a couple other things going like, CSA, Matter, basically, that standard. They're starting to get similar labeling and certificates stamped on the box to say, here's how safe it is. Here's what we have available. And if you want to comply with these standards, you have to meet these security requirements. That's coming. It's just, I think it's going to be a little while because it's costly, especially for a $20 device.
Right. And maybe that does go back to the idea of even just the testing. We have this conversation about non-IoT software, probably still have a major overlap with just how much has been tested, et cetera. I'm trying to avoid just always talking about cliches here or the familiar things, but secure SDLC, that ostensibly should include security testing. Maybe my question better here is IoT device testing appreciably different? Because it's software, but it's software on devices. Is that on device that made extra complexity for developers?
I think it has. Because, like you said, it's not just software. You're dealing with hardware that's underneath there. You're dealing with potentially, again, more enterprise-class devices, looking at a system on chip. You're looking at embedded root of trust. So once you have to deal in that avenue and then slap your various firmware and other software to do your actual operations on top, you have to be more security conscious as you're putting that code together. You're not going to get the same thing thinking about writing a Windows app or a mobile app, right? Completely different worlds. So, it's an evolution, I think, in mindset. And it's, we at Forrester have written about this. My peers, Sandy and Janet, they've written about some of these ideas, thinking about Sandy has some stuff on minimum viable security. Is when you start writing with security in mind, it's not an afterthought. It's a simple idea, right? Everyone should be doing this, but for decades we didn't. And now it's like, hey, maybe we should think of being secure from the start. Hot topic, right?
I know. And that's where I guess this is more of a comment than a question. I apologize, Paddy, but this is where I get worried about the idea that, well, we only have to be secure for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, like the life cycle of this device. And that worries me as, just a potential mindset, kind of just these are throwaway devices, essentially.
Yeah. They are, but think about your car. I know myself, my truck's 10 years old. It's an IoT device. In truth, it's a network of IoT devices. That's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down. But I have, dozens of IoT devices in my truck that's 10 years old. It's probably going to run for at least another 10 years if I take care of it. Okay, so a 20-year-old IoT device. And this is the thing, right? And I think this is what the industry has to think of, the IoT production industry has to think about. You may say, I have a 3-year lifespan on this device. Unless you code in a death date, which I think is going to really upset people, it's going to run a lot longer than your 3 years. And that's the idea that people have to think of. How often do you get rid of your desktop, your laptop, your thermostat, your doorbell camera? How often do you turn that over? And if the answer is 5-6 years, well, if the lifespan from the manufacturer isn't exceeding that, you're going to have problems.
I want everyone after this episode to go and take a few minutes to make sure that their cars are patched and up to date.
Good luck.
There's a question coming here, but first you're reminding me, a really great example of someone hard coding an end state into an IoT device is Nest smoke detectors. So those things, I think it's 9 years or 10 years, they go, no, my sensor can't detect things anymore. And it's dead. And oh my God, that annoys people because they've just spent $100 on this thing under ceiling, if not a few of them. But sort of the question related to this whole thing, as I started sitting here and thinking, listen, is really the problem that we're dealing with is these devices become cheaper, right? As they become cheaper, more of us have said, hey, let's grab one of those and, Lego bricks, whatever you want to call them, throw them on the wall or wherever in the house or in the industry. But the problem there is at the root is the thing has become so cheap that it costs more to secure than it does to build or throw out, really. So what do we have to do is in application security? I mean, I think it's not just IoT, right? It's even like code. There's this constant problem of there's not enough AppSec people. The ratio between AppSec to developers is always horrible and blah, 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 blah. Where should we be looking to try and figure out how do we make application security easier and more secure? I mean, it's probably the standard question of this show, but I'm curious to have your thoughts. Is there a magic bullet coming sometime soon, or how do we deal?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any magic bullet for it. That secure by design idea, right? That minimum viable security, it's always should be in the minds and the code side. I think working in tandem with that, you're seeing from the networking companies who are out there, enterprise ones are definitely down this path. But what happens in the enterprise slowly starts to translate, I think, into consumer markets, is they're starting to add more security components to their devices. So when you think of networking, what you're seeing from all the big security vendors in networking is you're seeing them add IoT security as part of their product stack. So that obviously under a license, but you can now start identifying your IoT devices in your enterprise. And it's now passive. So instead of having these massive systems that you have to manage and control and do all this, it becomes a passive discovery. And then you can get to automated rule sets so that you can now start classifying this traffic. The same, I suspect, will start happening at the home IoT as well, in that home routers being integrating software from security vendors. You're seeing that now. There are plenty of vendors out there who are including home security software into it. And these are not low names that are being added. I don't mean any offense, but this isn't Bob's antivirus. These are major security players who are adding their software to home router systems. So now we can start protecting the IoT devices on your home network. And they can do some basic discovery. Once they detect the device, they can get some general information about it and say, this thing is a little old. I recommend you take this offline because you're going to run into problems if you don't. Hey, if you can't, I'll wall it off for you. I'll make it so that only this device on your home network gets access to it and it'll only talk out to these 3 sites. So I think we're hitting everything right. And I see it in the enterprise market, really, of more vendors are getting into the space to add IT security as part of their offerings. So it becomes less costly and less intrusive to add that to their security stack. That'll translate into the consumer market, I think, shortly as more of these, unfortunately, as more of the attacks happen. It's tragic that's going to have to happen, but at the same time, it's going to prompt these home networking manufacturers to start taking advantage of solutions that are out there in enterprise and add them to the consumer market.
And I think one way to you already mentioned too, Paddy, the idea of roots of trust, certificates. And one way I think I'd try to answer John's question is that Let's Encrypt and like the Acme protocol has made it so that it's no cost to obtain certs, no cost to manage certs other than the engineering overhead to implement and operate. So I think that's a positive route for there. But I'm also, as I was listening to you to discuss that, I was also trying to grasp for a second example and running out of ideas really quick. So maybe as we start to wrap up here, there's Let's Encrypt. You mentioned like antivirus and poor Bob. But are there other angles that you would like to see or other directions that you'd like to see these secure designs? Because, I mentioned early on the programming language should see, but we didn't really go down that route because that doesn't really feel like that's what the underlying root cause is. So to your credit, I think that was a good thing to kind of skip over. Is there something else instead that you would love to see in 2025? A lot of IoT devices start to advertise, label, et cetera, something that they're demonstrating a better design.
I think that the direction that's being pushed, if you will, by Cyber Trust Mark, I think is a good path. And the end of life dates being clearly displayed on the boxes can help. I think it can help to educate. And that's probably really the thing that has to happen most. It's the education side. I will throw money down, all the money I have in my wallet. I just stopped at the ATM yesterday, so I have some. That most home users have no clue about IoT security at all, right? They're not us. They don't deal with us in day to day. But if the makers of these devices can help educate the home user a little bit more about here's what can happen when stuff goes bad on your IoT device, and make it personal, because this is your personal data that's being shared through these devices. Do you want your cameras to be shared publicly? I wouldn't, but so these are the things I think that has to happen. And that's probably the next step that these manufacturers can start really doing on these devices. It's just educate people about being more secure. Because if not, they're going to run out and buy a $15 doorbell camera, and the data is just going to be offloaded to some unknown person in some unknown country. It's bad enough when data gets shared to Amazon or Google and that gets hacked from there. It's happened in the past. But when it's some unknown company, you couldn't pronounce the name if you tried, and who knows where the data is going, that's when things get really bad. So people need to be educated about the problems with buying the cheapest thing on the shelf.
Yeah, and I'll yes and that with the idea that hopefully those manufacturers also go the extra step of saying this is why we don't have the standard default password. This is why we have auto updates on by default, and this is why you're going to spend another $15 in 5 years when it goes end of life. Who knows? But Paddy, this has been a great conversation. We're going to have you back before your end of life, which sounds very grim. So let's at least say, but before the next 5 years pass, so we could continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Wanted to thank John as well, and thank everybody for listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.